Welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor, a podcast where I want to think more deeply with you about Christian faith and life.
Easier much is the path of least resistance.
Warm Christmas cookie, Yankee Candle, Advent greetings, you believers, non-believers, unaffiliated believers, you sort of believers, think-em-a-believers, all of yous, welcome. My 9%ers, my non-university unstudents, welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor. Duden, that's German plural for dudes, but I mean for it to be inclusive of women. Duden, it's not easy to think critically. Partly our schools, especially universities, here in late 2018, simply don't train us how to think critically. But partly, it's just human nature.
Easier much is the path of least resistance.
What is that path? Mindlessly assuming the attitudes, values, and practices of those around us? What is that path? Being a sheeple. Sheeple are people who are functionally sheep. At Costco, sheeple get in the longest line because it's closest. Never mind that there's two shorter lines if you just go to the right 25 yards. Same dynamic at the movie theater, at the gas station. Get in line, sheeple. Don't give a thought to wheres or the whys of it all. But the sheeple principle is also at work when it comes to societal understandings and attitudes. We unwittingly adopt the ideas of those around us. And we do so because then we're accepted. We're part of the group. There's safety in the herd. The wolf won't attack us when we're all together, would he? Only the strays get picked off by the dragon. Bah! It takes work to think critically. Careful analysis, study of something for a dedicated season, asking tough questions, all of those take effort. And more, thinking critically will get you targeted by the rest of the nose in their butts herd of sheep. People who ask thoughtful questions are told, hey, stop being difficult. Why the bad attitude? You're disagreeable. Why do you challenge authority? Believe me, I know those sayings because I've heard all of them most of my Christian life. Ed, you seem to have a bad attitude. And you doggone know it, but this isn't a lesser developed country thing. It's not an economic class thing, not a Western thing. It's a human thing. And here's the point. It affects people inside their religions too. Bah! Me? I began to deeply sink my roots into my faith when I began to ask and answer pesky questions, addressed those nagging doubts down inside the emotional caverns of my heart about Christianity. Is Jesus the only Lord? Doggone it. Why? Is the Bible truthful? Why? Are Christian ideals the best ideals for humanity? Why? When I began to ask and answer those, I fell in love with Christ. I realized there's just nothing like him in the whole universe of religions. In fact, after this World Religions series, I'm going to do a series on what makes Jesus unique. Too many Christians have a little Jesus, a boring Jesus, a prophety Jesus, but they miss the glory of his person. Still more, in my season of honest to Ed digging, I began to fall in love with my faith like never before. It was such a transformative era of my life that I began to resent Sunday church. Because Church services fell so short of the majesty and beauty of who Christ really is. Anyway, boys and girls, the sheeple principle is a beast to escape. Bah! And one glaring example of that comes with the religion of Islam. Now, the West has been involved in a serious interface with the Middle East, with Muslims, for at least some 80 years, since the 1938 discovery of crude oil in Saudi Arabia. 80 years later, and people, still have their head in the sand about Islam. 9/11 happened what, 2 months? No, 17 years ago. And Westerners still refuse to study Muslim history. 19 men carried out mass evil in the name of Allah, but there's no school district anywhere that requires the study of Islam. Christians today are being genocided in North Africa, and no one pays any mind. American colleges are requiring microaggression classes, but not one of them requires a class on Islam. It's a bizarro thing. So today, here in episode 76, we're going to look at Islam. First, some numbers. In America, Muslims account for about 1% of the population. There are about 3.5 million of them. By population, what do you guess is the largest Muslim country? Nope, it's not in the Middle East. Indonesia has 209 million Muslims. You might also be surprised to know that India is number 2. In total, there are some 1.6 billion, that's with a B, Jerry, Muslims worldwide. Ed, what are some contributions that stem from Muslim countries? Well, you know me, I aims to please. Today we have algebra in part because of Islam. The Arabic al-jabr, G-A-B-R, means the reunion of broken parts. Algebra is that mathematical approach to solving problems with variables instead of only numbers. In the 9th century AD, Mohammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, people with weird last names, right? Khwarizmi, he wrote books on mathematics that were then later studied by Latins, Europeans, when the trade routes were opened up with the Middle East. Because of Islam today, we have coffee. The first production of coffee began in the 15th century in Yemen among Sufi monasteries. Dear Yemenis, thank you so much. As someone who cherishes the aroma of ground beans and a good cup of joe, I'm grateful for coffee. And I don't know that I've had Yemeni coffee. I've had Yemeni coffee, but not Yemeni coffee. One webpage says that the first clock built in human history was built in 1206 by a man named Al-Jazari. He lived in southeast Turkey. Clocks, right, the measuring of time, makes human existence easier, helps societies to flourish. Thank you, Mr. Al-Jazari. Additionally, while an ancient board game was first played in India, the game of chess, as we have it today, was developed in ancient Persia, which is today's Iran. 8 days ago, I played an hour and a half of chess with my friend Mark. He beat me in the first game, and then we played to a draw in the second game. It's such a great game to stretch your brain. So there's a few contributions to humanity from Muslim lands. What I want to do next, you guys, is go through some basic information with you about the Muslim worldview, about Muslim beliefs. First, creation. As in the Bible, human history begins with Adam. Made from clay, Adam was the crown of God's creation. And then God made Adam his deputy, his caliph. However, human beings were not made in the image of God, because it would imply too close a connection between a mere creature and the Almighty Creator of all things, Allah. But nevertheless, in every human being there lies an innate knowledge of Allah and a responsibility to serve Him as Lord and Master. So we can see some overlay there with a Judeo-Christian understanding, although we would argue that we are made in the image of God. Then there's the fall. And per the Quran, Islam's holy book, the fall occurred when Adam forgot to walk in the right way. So for Muslims, sin is forgetfulness or heedlessness, a failure to remember. So this forgetting to obey stems from inherent weakness, but not active rebellion against God, as the Bible would have it. And then once Adam repented, God quickly forgave him. And from that time on, Adam lived a perfect life. And so God then elevated Adam to the status of a prophet. Forgiveness. In Islam, God's forgiveness requires no action like a sacrifice or atonement. Then there's certainly no agony on God's part, as we find in Christianity with Golgotha. No, in Islam, Allah simply wills it, and it is so. And Islam is huge on the power of Allah's will. The remedy for the forgetfulness of sin is remembrance. And this is why God, per Islam, sent so many prophets, 124,000 of them in all, from Adam to Mohammad. And these prophets came to call people to remember, to forsake idols, to purify themselves of sin. Just one way to overcome sin is to practice salah, ritual prayer, and many Muslims, millions of Muslims stop and pray 5 times per day. With regard to lifestyle, Muslims follow Sharia, which means road or path. Sharia is a divine code of guidance for every situation in life. And it can be rather like the Old Testament's long lists that incorporate huge swaths of life. So in Islam, obedience is the way to salvation. So it's salvation by works, not necessarily by faith in God. Correct belief is confessing the Shahada, which goes like this in English: there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. As I said before, Islam holds a high belief in God's predestination of events, both good and bad. However, there is some room in Muslim theology for human freedom and free will. People must discipline themselves and devote themselves in obedience to God. There's no mediator between people and Allah. And in Islam, Muhammad is a prophet, not a savior. The love of God is conditioned upon a faithful response to His will, and then God may choose to pardon, but He may just as well choose not. Because in Islam, His forgiveness is inscrutable. There's no assurance. There's no certainty that God will choose to forgive any particular sin. Islamic theology draws on 2 images to describe Allah's final judgment. The first one, the scale, refers to the weighing of good and evil in one's life. And so the way they think through it is that each person has 2 angels that are assigned to you, to us. One records the good, the other records the evil. The bridge is the other image, and in Muslim faith, the bridge extends across the fire of hell, and it's finer than a hair and sharper than a sword. The righteous on the day of judgment will cross the bridge like lightning, and others will only be able to crawl. Those whose deeds have fallen short of Allah's standard will slip and fall into the flames beneath, but those who make it across the bridge will be ushered into a paradise of sensual delights. And just so you know, I got all that information from a book called Is the Father of Jesus the God of Mohammad by a scholar named Timothy George. But when we get to Muslim eschatology, one Indian writer said, quote, that the threat of doom or of hell weighs heavy upon the Muslim psyche. Islam, the name itself, you guys, means listen or submit. Islam is a religion about submission. Children submit to their parents, especially their fathers. Wives submit to their husbands. Women in general across the Muslim world submit to men. Non-Muslims, in Arabic it's harbis. Harbis are forced in different ways, like taxation, tribute, clothing, public mores. Non-Muslims in majority Muslim countries are forced to submit to Muslims, because non-Muslims are viewed as inferior to Muslims, and then everyone is forced to submit to Allah. You know me, I like people who can laugh at themselves. I think the ability to laugh at oneself signals both maturity and humility. And in my last episode, Why the Jews, number 75, I told several jokes that Jews tell about one another. After a serious web search, I couldn't find any sites where Muslims tell jokes on Muslims. I did find websites about why Muslims cannot joke about Islam. And I could find some where secularists from the Middle East tell jokes, but that's not the same. Are Muslims afraid to tell jokes about themselves, about Islam? I don't know. I think they believe the whole thing is so holy that one shouldn't joke about it. But I'll tell you this, I do know that Westerners are afraid to tell jokes about Muslims. For instance, I found a 2008 article in the British newspaper The Guardian that chronicled how the BBC News Network is afraid of anyone telling Muslim jokes on their shows. And I just wonder, is that inability to joke healthy? Shout outs. Crow time indeed. Folks, please know, I'm not taking any one-time gift monies or pledge dollars and using those to travel overseas or drive a Ferrari. Every dollar of support money goes back into the show. I have to pay for RSS feed hosting, website hosting, domain names, equipment, constant Facebook advertising, promotional materials, mailings. So your Patreon pledge money isn't making me wealthy. It's all going back into running and building the show. Hey, please think about making a $1 per month pledge to the Uncensored Unprofessor at Patreon. I'm happy to say I have some $2 per month pledgers now, but I'd be happy to have a whole caboodle full of $1 monthly pledgers. Is the UU worth $1 per month to you? If so, wish me a Merry Christmas. You wish me a Merry Christmas. You wish me a Merry Christmas and a $1 pledge. $5 or more per month will get you a UU coaster and some bumper stickers. $20 a month or more will get you a UU coffee cup along with the coaster and bumper stickers. Oh, and $5 per month or more pledges get access to 2 exclusive members-only podcasts each month. Sometimes those podcasts are personal. Sometimes they involve more sophisticated thinking. Other times I do long movie reviews in them. Oh, and if you're sitting there wondering, yes, the mail continues to be swagged. Why not have it swagged for you? Finally, very kind Facebook kudos are being poured out on the UU. Genuine thanks to new listener Frank H. and to you, Joanna JJ, for all your regular Facebook kindness. Here's an intriguing fact most Americans won't know. Muslims have enslaved more people in human history than any other religion. We tend to think of the European American slave trade. We don't study at all the Muslim slave trade. GlobalSlaveryIndex.org reports that North Africa Muslim countries have active slavery and slave trading occurring today. Across Muslim history, 14 million people were enslaved, and an additional 15 million were made slaves in the 20th century. How many were enslaved during American slavery? Well, about 12.5 million. And I'm just going to ask, does ongoing institutional slavery dignify people, slaves, or their owners? Ed, why are you being a hater? No, it's not hateful to report facts. I'm not calling people names, judging their hearts. I'm reporting facts. The reporting of facts is part of critical thinking. Who are the most famous Muslims ever? Well, obviously Muhammad, the great military commander, charismatic founder, and last prophet of Islam. He started Islam in the late 6th century AD. Other famous Muslims include the historic boxer Muhammad Ali, who died in 2016, Mustafa Ataturk, the founder of modern-day Turkey, Sultan Saladin, 12th century, he led Egypt against the Christian Crusaders. I'm going to say more about the Crusaders in a bit. Abu Ja'far Muhammad, he was a 10th century astronomer. Astronomy. In the Muslim world, religious leaders and rulers are especially at the top of the list. There was a book published in 2009 called The 500 Most Influential Muslims, and they put at the top of their list the King of Saudi Arabia today. Second place went to Ayatollah Khamenei, the spiritual leader of Iran, and the King of Morocco took third place in terms of being an influential, famous Muslim. Now, what I'm going to say next about some Muslim history, I want you to know that I taught a class called Byzantine Church History for 7 years, and I studied the interface between Islam and Byzantine Christianity carefully, which means I probably read some 10 books and 20 journal articles for that class. And out of that, I want to give you a snapshot of some disturbing Muslim history. Huge swaths of the Middle East prior to Muhammad's swift rise to power had been Christianized. That means most of the population in the Middle East had been made Christian. That's not the same as saying they were all devout Christians, but those were sort of Christianized lands that had been changed through missionary efforts. Swiftly, how did Muslims overtake those lands? And the answer is through violence. Warfare, raids, razing villages, corporeal punishment, capturing Christian children and converting them into Muslim jihadi warriors in something scholars call devshirme. Even today, it's utterly brutal to be a Jew or a Christian in a Muslim country. You need to keep your head down. In fact, if you live in a Muslim majority country, or you did, I want to hear your story. Please email me at uncensoredunprofessor@gmail.com. Significantly, with all the refugees, what's been occurring recently in Syria involves the genocide of Syrian Christians, even though the mainstream media refuse to report this. And in the last decade, Egyptian Muslims have been bombing Coptic Christian churches in Egypt. So, not surprisingly, the percentage of Christians in Egypt is rapidly diminishing. Why the constant violence? Well, Islam is unique in that warfare comprises an important element in their theology. Per strict fundamentalist Muslims, Allah commands them to conquer the planet. And per that dogma, quote, any Muslim may shed blood to seize the enemy's goods. Now, as I'm going to say at the end of today's episode, I'm going to leave it up to Muslims themselves how to dispute those verses of the Quran, how literal that should be taken. But there's a long, steady history of violence. And that started with Muhammad. Let me give you just one example. Constantly called a prophet of peace by Westerners, Muhammad warned the city of Medina to submit to him. While that was going on, he had his followers dig a trench around the city. And then Muhammad himself, as the legend goes, used a pickaxe and 3 times struck a huge rock that was hampering the trench digging. Each time he struck the rock, lightning flashed forth, and the rock was split. And the helpers all cried, Allahu Akbar, God is great. Then, after defeating the inhabitants of Medina, Muhammad went into the city and had a trench dug inside the city. He lined up the men of the city along the trench, and by himself he went along beheading them in batches. Some 600 men were killed that way by Muhammad. He spared the young men in puberty. 5 centuries before the Crusades began, Islamic jihadists had been overwhelming Christians and wreaking genocide on Christians. I mentioned how big chunks of the Middle East have been Christianized. Well, Islam began to spread 5 centuries before the Crusades began. So, what this means is that over half of Christendom, again, a religion that started in the Middle East, over half of Christendom had been leveled by Islam before the Crusades. Jerusalem fell to the Muslims in 637. And 3 of the 5 main centers of Christianity, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, were conquered and Islamized before the First Crusade. So the Crusades were a response to the sweeping Muslim armies, the sweeping Muslim domination and invasion. In fact, the Crusades by Christians started 249 years after Rome itself had been sacked by a Muslim army. If you've been to Rome, it's fascinating to stand there and think, wow, the Muslims conquered this at one point. Simply put, you guys, there's a long history, about 1,400 years worth, of Muslims using violence to reach their goals. Yes, Christians also have a long history of ungodly violence, which Christians universally denounce. But an important difference here is that whereas Jesus refused to use or encourage violence to promote his agenda, Muhammad used violence and recorded in the Quran that Allah wants Muslims to use violence to bring the whole earth to the feet of Allah. And it's really important that we see that about Muhammad because he's viewed as the ideal, the archetypal, the symbolic, representative, perfect Muslim, and he used violence. Here's a more personal way to critically process these realities. Would you, my ear glued to the device listener, would you rather have your daughter grow up in a Western or a Muslim country? Why did that emotion flicker through your belly? Why is that? Because the answer is obvious. Muslim majority nations don't grant women the full privilege of being human. In some Muslim countries, Christian girls have had acid thrown in their faces. Still others are sold into slavery. In fact, you should go check it out because in 2015, Atlantic magazine, a left-leaning magazine, so there's the bias accusation can be dismissed there, they published an article entitled, "What ISIS Really Wants." Quote, "The Islamic State is no mere collection of psychopaths. It's a religious group with carefully considered beliefs, among them that they are a key agent of the coming apocalypse." That's the end of that quote. But the gist of that article was that devout, literalist students of the Quran are commanded to serve a caliphate, a political empire driven by Islamic eschatological ideology, and per that ideology, it's godly to use force to the glory of Allah and the spread of Islam. Ed, are all Muslims violent? Come on, let's not be stupid. Of course not. The overwhelming majority want only to live in peace. But fundamentalist Muslims are too often violent or condone violence, and this presents enormous challenges both inside and outside of Islam. On another front, shifting gears, as this series would attest, the world's religions do well to learn about one another. I like to quote Dennis Prager. He says, "If we can't agree, at least we should understand one another. It's good to know where the other is coming from and why, even if we finally can't agree." But what particularly do Muslims believe about Jesus? Well, they teach that Christians have a corrupted story about Jesus, and Mohammad himself believed this. Muhammad said that God would never allow his own son, the prophet Jesus, to be crucified. Christians fabricated that part of the story. And the Quran itself says, "But they killed him not, nor crucified him, but so it was made to appear to them, and those who differ therein are full of doubts, and with no certain knowledge, but only conjecture to follow. For a surety they killed him not." Now, the thinking in Islam is that Muhammad could not be wrong about Jesus, so Christians have erred and lied about him. My own son, John, went on a college missions trip to Indonesia back in 2008. And their group stayed at a college where all the local Muslim men wanted to talk about was Jesus. It's interesting, he said, that the Muslims there had no problem believing Jesus worked miracles. Instead, their deep challenge was, how can Jesus be God's son when Allah is one who towers over all of reality? So those Muslims were deeply troubled by the biblical portrayal of Jesus as God, because for them that's an idea that detracts from the greatness of Allah. Finally, today, you guys, I want to ask some questions that I think Muslims need to resolve inside of Islam. So, as an outsider, I won't pretend to know how to answer these questions for Muslims, but these are questions that I think are important. And the first is, how should the Quran be studied and understood? Devout Muslims mostly memorize the Quran. Quran in Arabic itself means recite. So the Muslims that have memorized the Quran don't so much study it or dispute different verses as they do just memorize it. There's a Canadian Muslim named Irshad Manji, and she says the challenge inside Islam concerns the proper hermeneutical approach to the Quran. Are there parts that are figurative, allegorical? Is it possible to understand the Quran without appeal to the hadiths? Hadiths are additional Islamic tradition written by successors who lived generations after Muhammad. The hadiths are literary traditions that stand alongside the Quran. But Irshad Manji's argument is that, quote, even moderates interpret the religion's most holy text, the Quran, in a literal and unquestioning way, end quote. So how should the Quran be studied and understood? Only literally? Second, long-term question I have would be, how should Muslims relate to non-Muslims? Again, to Harbis. Is force the only faithful approach? Or to put it still differently, is there a place for persuasion and argumentation to win people over to Islam? Related to that one, are there any situations where a non-Muslim could live in the Muslim land with equal freedom of a Muslim under Sharia? Do non-Muslims simply have to submit? The experience in Europe is proving to be fascinating, if brutal on that very point. And then I wonder, is there any possibility in Islam for the separation of church and state, for mosque and state? Now, I have political scientist Christian friends who lecture and write on this topic, but what do Muslims say? Can a nation be blessed of a law if it's not Muslim? Or can a government be blessed by a law if it's not directly serving Sharia law? And then I think there are something what I'm calling core challenges. Do Muslims in the West believe the Western University mantra that, quote, global Muslims are angry because of European colonialism? Do they believe that? Is that why we see this violence? Or do Muslims see any indigenous, any cultural, any endemic problems inside of their own nations and governments and themselves? For me, that's a hugely important question. There are problems and challenges inside of Christianity. I want to address those and work through those. I wonder if Muslims want to do the same about their own nations and cultures. And then finally, I would want to ask, how can Christians and Muslims work together for the good of the planet? Maybe that would involve stuff along human rights or animal husbandry or service to the poor. Despite our significant theological differences, can we nevertheless team up in a post-religious world to become a blessing? And the answer to that for the two largest religions on the planet, Christianity and Islam, I think that's crucial. I want to thank you dearly for listening today. Please, for the love of humanity, start your engine. Turn your brains on, everybody.